Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss Britain Trump again as Boris Johnson continues his hideous mirror dance of the orange one and gets caught up in his own version of being caught with highly sensitive information they really shouldn't have knocking about. Does there come a point where Boris Johnson should be investigated for espionage against the state? But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So the Times has broken a story that really should be getting a great deal more attention. It is the story of the government refusing to let Boris Johnson have 24 of his notebooks back because, upon reviewing them, they contain a great deal more than illegal parties. They contain highly sensitive information. Johnson appears to have been detailing information that can only be seen by people with the highest level of security clearance, according to the report. And I suppose we should not be surprised for a couple of main reasons. First, Johnson simply doesn't think rules or even conventional norms apply to him. Only yesterday, Akoba said that working for the Daily Mail without clearance from them was a clear breach of the rules. But these rules are really conventions. All the fuss about Sue Gray and what gardening leave period Akoba should stipulate, well, Sue Gray is complying with their decision. But Boris Johnson has now carried out work twice without being authorised. In a way, Boris Johnson is doing us a public service, just as the orange one is helping America out, if only we would listen. These pioneers in the field of behaviour are selflessly demonstrating just how having your government run according to conventions instead of cold hard rules with robust enforcement can be abused by those with no morals. But for all of Trump and Johnson's efforts, neither country is really learning the lesson and replacing conventions with actual rules with consequences for breaching them. Second reason we shouldn't really be surprised is because it has been an open secret for years that Boris Johnson represents a threat to national security. When Theresa May made him Foreign Secretary, he was reportedly not given direct oversight over MI6. Now, this isn't established fact, but the extent to which it was talked about that Johnson was a weak link with the Russians has been reported openly for years. When Russia carried out a deadly and intended deadly attack on British soil, Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, I remind you, slipped his security detail, went to an Italian party hosted by a Russian oligarch and son of a KGB officer who was there, who was known to have spied on the UK during the Cold War. He got drunk, of course he did, he's an alcoholic, without his security present, remember, in the presence of at least one Russian spy during an international crisis in which Russia had attacked the UK. A more clear-cut case of treason you could hardly imagine. This one episode alone should have had Johnson not just ejected from government, but from the Conservative Party itself. Frankly, you have to ask why this was not investigated by a parliamentary committee at the time. He was sacked as a Conservative minister for lying about an affair. But not an act of treason. He was investigated by Parliament for telling lies about socialising, but not for socialising with enemies of the state. At a time, with Russian agents and Putin oligarchs, at a time when UK citizens were understood to have been attacked by the Russian state on British soil. I cannot emphasise enough just how complicit the entire Conservative Party, for all their fake patriotism, and most of the mainstream media, ditto, are in not only covering up for this, but for allowing him to become Prime Minister when they all knew about this. This was not something that came out after he became Prime Minister. We knew about it at the time. They knew about it at the time. From the summer of 2019, Boris Johnson was the most senior member of our security services. There was nobody left to stop him selling out our country. And I go back to that event because it makes this news story even more horrific. Because you can read an article about Boris Johnson having recorded highly sensitive information in personal notebooks, and you can think that because he doesn't understand consequences, he's just inadvertently, albeit recklessly, risking national security again. That he is unthinkingly putting this information into notebooks, and that the concern is that he might hand it over to a ghostwriter to help him with his memoirs, who all of a sudden will have created an inadvertent security breach. Sort of like when Matt Hancock handed over his WhatsApp messages to Isabel Oakeshott, something for which he's still not faced charges. But this would be much worse in Johnson's case. Only we know that Johnson slipped his security detail to get drunk with Russian agents, saying who knows what to them. That was deliberate. He didn't inadvertently tell his security he was going to the toilet and then just on the spur of the moment hop on a plane to Italy, having forgotten to tell them. He willfully left without telling anyone. And why? Because he knew what he was doing was dead against the security interests of the country. This Times report that if the notebooks were ever to be returned to Johnson, they would have to be appropriately stored in a secure location. Now, if this were any other Prime Minister, I would still be saying, why return them at all? Why were they even recording this information? Just as with the case with Trump and his bog full of top secret files, a former Prime Minister should not have these records after they leave office. There is no good reason for keeping their own personal record. But with it being Boris Johnson, you definitely wouldn't hand them back. Are they even mad to consider it? In the Lord of the Rings books, Gandalf says that they can't give the ring to Tom Bombadil for safekeeping because he wouldn't appreciate the importance. One day he would just carelessly tossing it away, not meaning any harm. It would just he doesn't know what it is. Well, Boris Johnson is basically a malevolent Tom Bombadil. He doesn't think anything's important apart from his immediate gratification. He would leave the notebooks just lying around because it would be too much effort for him to put them back away because he might want to read them in a couple of hours. Doesn't matter that there might be other people in the room while he leaves it. He might not intend any harm, but nonetheless, it'll be accessible to anyone who comes across them. Wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. I mean, he's just bought that £400 manor, big place, bound to need people to help keep it clean and so on. There'll be job applications for that. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a load of job applications for positions at this new house with a disproportionate number of people who were born in Russia, in the hopes that they can find all sorts of carelessly abandoned documents while they're dusting the furniture. But even if he did agree to keep them in a secure location, he would just as easily show it to Sergei, the house guest, if they just inquired about its contents. He'd just see no harm in doing so because he would see no harm to himself. The way I imagine Boris Johnson is he sees himself as like the player of an immersive video game. He's the only real person. Everyone and everything else is artificial. So he can do as he likes, no consequences. The fact that the notebooks were written by Johnson with the specific intention of informing his memoirs, that is also highly suspect. Granted, former ministers have to have their memoirs checked by security services before being cleared for publication for just such events. But before it would be submitted to the government, how many people would have been told these state secrets? His wife, house guest, the publisher's editor, other writers with whom he may be collaborating, Sergei the window cleaner. These are notebooks which Sunak is trying to stop a security vetted judge from seeing. The idea you would ever give them back to Boris Johnson is a sick joke. This is a man who really should be prosecuted for crimes against his country. And I don't mean his failures as Prime Minister. That's not a crime. We did that by allowing him to become Prime Minister. People voted for him because he's that funny man off the telly. That's our fault as a society. No, he's actually and quite deliberately threatened the security of our country. The very fact that Johnson had been making his own copies of sensitive documents with the intention of taking them to a home where there's loads of people who haven't signed the Official Secrets Act, that should be deeply concerning. The idea that he's been copying things down so that he can recall it later for his memoirs. He wants anyone who'll bother to pay for his book to see it. That should be deeply concerning. The very notion that the government might, under any circumstances, hand them back just seems mind-boggling to me. He should surely have been told when they discovered them, you will never be given these back, and if one leak of any of this highly sensitive information is ever traced back to you, you will be charged with offences under the Official Secrets Act, and never mind cheese and chorizo, you will be doing bread and water for the rest of your life. The only moat you'll have around your home is the trail of piss on the floor left by your cellmate. That is what I would be saying to Boris Johnson if I was the Prime Minister now. And that people in the media and the Conservative Party ever supported this traitor, to say nothing of continue to do so. they should all be treated with the utmost suspicion themselves forevermore. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.